So reset sign. I'm not turn off my phone so it's not going to be a disruption.
Alright guys, so I guess I'll begin. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Khan, and today my thesis is entitled, Who Cares About the Kids? An Analysis of the Global Failure of Mental Health Policy. Now you may have noticed that WHO is capitalized. It stands for World Health Organization. What I aim to show you today is how nations across the world are failing to fulfill the objectives and recommendations put forth by the World Health Organization in order to improve mental health globally, especially for adolescents. So what I'm specifically doing is I'm looking at 3 different nations, from a high-income nation, a middle-income nation, and a low-income nation, to see whether or not these nations fulfill these objectives and recommendations. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about mental health. So there are a series of determinants or factors that can lead to the development of a mental health disorder. For example, we have biological causes of mental health disorders. You obviously know of a major depressive disorder. What you may not know is that major depressive disorder is also found to be linked to disorders with the oxidative phosphorylation system in the mitochondria. Furthermore, there are socioeconomic determinants of mental health. Things like family life, income, education, discrimination, and even employment level can affect the mental health of an individual. I also mentioned that I'm going to be specifically talking about adolescents. Now, targeting mental health in adolescents is extremely important. We don't want these mental health issues to reside in an adolescent as they grow older, as they go into jobs, college, etc. So we want to target mental health issues in adolescents as early as possible. Furthermore, we find that up to 50% of mental health issues begin before the age of 14. So clearly there are these mental health issues present, we just need to identify them and treat them. We also see that depression is one of the leading causes of disability and illness. Now, during adolescence, this disability is a severe consequence. During adolescence is the period when students are applying to colleges, applying to graduate schools, applying to employment jobs. Well, maybe not graduate schools, but they are applying to colleges and furthermore employment. So we really need to target depression in these adolescents in order to alleviate this cause of disability or illness. More significantly, we find that suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death in individuals aged 15 to 19 years old. So we see that not only if we don't target these issues early on, they will suffer later on, but they might not even have a life to begin with. So now that I've kind of set the context as to what I'm doing here, I want to talk a little bit more about how I'm conducting this analysis of these 3 nations. So as I mentioned, I picked a high-income country, a middle-income country, and a low-income country. I chose these nations from the WHO Mind list, or the WHO Mental Health and Development list. It's a series of about 19 countries, and I chose the ones that had the highest proportion of adolescents, and obviously ones that were from those 3 categories. And the way I compared the mental health policies from these countries is I utilized this document. This is the Mental Health Action Plan, intended to last from the years 2013 to 2020. As you can see here, this action plan calls for change in the attitudes of mental health disorders. It calls for a change in the way services are delivered, and rightly so. In other ways, Dr. Chan, the Director General of the World Health Organization, wants to change the way mental health services are delivered and implemented because she and the World Health Organization sees this impending, growing epidemic of mental health disorders worldwide. So what else this Mental Health Action Plan has, as you have all in front of you, are the series of objectives. There are 4 major objectives, each with their global targets and implications and assessments for completion. I utilized these 4 objectives in my analysis for comparison of whether or not these mental health policies fulfill these requirements or objectives as stated in the document. So let me go through each of these objectives with you. So objective 1 is to strengthen effective leadership and governance for mental health. The way I assess this, basically this objective is all talking about influencing legislation to enforce mental health, right? So the way I assess this is whether or not mental health policy was present within a nation. Also, I sought to see whether or not these mental health policies maintain basic human rights, as this is one of the indicators for objective 1 of the Mental Health Action Plan. So the way I assessed human rights is I looked at what the OHCHR, the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, looked at how you can assess human rights within a nation. And there are a couple different analyses you can conduct. You can conduct a qualitative analysis or a quantitative analysis. I chose to do the qualitative analysis of seeing whether or not basic human rights standards are maintained for adolescents in mental health institutions, because the quantitative analysis, that data just isn't there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but first I'm going to move on to Objective 2. Objective 2 aims to provide comprehensive, integrated, and responsive mental health and social care settings in community-based or social care services in community-based settings. Basically, all this objective is saying that it wants to serve more individuals with mental health disorders. In other words, it wants to reduce the treatment gap. Now, the treatment gap is the percentage of individuals who present with a mental health disorder and are not receiving treatment for it. So I looked at the treatment gap in these 3 nations that I was comparing to see, and I compared them to like the standard of the treatment gap globally, which was, so the average in low and middle income countries was 76 to 85%. So in low and middle income countries, 76 to 85% of individuals are not receiving treatment for their severe mental health disorder. In high income countries, the treatment gap is a little bit less. We see 35 to 50% of individuals are not receiving treatment for their severe mental health disorder. I also want to point out that this data doesn't just include adolescents. The data for just adolescents isn't there. So I actually drew this from the general population. Objective 3 is to implement strategies for promotion and prevention in mental health. In other words, we want to get the word about mental health out. We want to reduce stigma, and we want to target vulnerable populations. Now, vulnerable groups are individuals in the population who are more likely to develop a disorder when placed in a dire situation as compared to other individuals. So adolescents and women can be considered a vulnerable group. So those are the 2 groups I chose to look at. To be more clear, I wanted to see whether or not they were represented in mental health policy. I wanted to see if they were granted special protections. Another factor I looked at was suicide. Now, World Mental Health Day was this past October 2019, and the theme was suicide prevention. So I wanted to take a closer look at suicide. So I'm going to take a step back from the objectives for just a second. For those of you who don't know, a suicide occurs every 40 seconds. To put that into perspective, this morning I woke up and brushed my teeth for 2 minutes, and in that time period, 3 people lost their life to suicide. In the span of this 20-minute thesis presentation, about 13 people will lose their life to suicide. This is a growing epidemic, and this rate is only increasing. It's only getting bigger. I also want to point out this graph to you. So this is the suicide rate by age and income level. Age is on the x-axis, and total suicide deaths are on the y-axis. The graphs that are in red, those are the low and middle income nations. The parts that are in blue are the high income nations. What I really want to point out to you is this jump in suicide deaths between the age of 10 and 20. As you may recall, the age of between 10 and 20 is the adolescent age, between 10 and 19. So I want to make it clear that this jump occurs during adolescence, and thus suicide is an impending crisis in adolescence. I also want to demonstrate that the global average for adolescent suicides is 4.1 per 100,000 adolescents, and that the global average for the entire general population of the world is 10.5 per 100,000 people. Now, that being said, I want to move on to Objective 4 of the Mental Health Action Plan. And Objective 4 is basically just about collecting routine mental health information. They want to maintain collecting resources for the prevalence of mental health disorders, suicide rates, treatment gap, etc. And the way I assessed this was just the presence of routine mental health data. This is actually a lot more difficult than it sounds, in that a lot of nations just didn't have mental health data. Now, with that being said, I want to move on to the nations themselves. So like I said, I chose a low-income nation, a middle-income nation, and a high-income nation. So I did this because I wanted to see what were the discrepancies, if any, in terms of resources that could lead to more or less fulfillment of the World Health Organization objectives. So my low-income nation is Uganda. Uganda is located in Central Africa. It has a relatively high population, and it is a growing population. In fact, it is the 15th fastest growing nation in the world. Almost half the population is under the age of 19, and 76% of Ugandans live in rural areas. Now, I wanted to bring up this idea of rurality because the adjusted odds of receiving mental health treatment in a metropolitan area is 47% higher than those receiving mental health treatment in rural areas. Thus, being in a rural area can significantly limit one's access to mental health treatment. I also want to talk about Uganda's mental health policy. Now, this is obviously just a summary, this isn't the entire mental health bill, but it does list some of the major aims of the mental health bill. You can see that it does use aged language. It does mention human rights, but we don't see a lot of objectives presented here. First and foremost, we see the lack of routine collection of mental health data. Thus, this policy fails to fulfill Objective 4. We also see a lack of protection for both adolescents and women. And this is significant because this leads to the presence of human rights violations. Women are very much abused in these mental health facilities, undergoing severe sexual harassment and rape. What this mental health policy failed to provide, as a lack of the fulfillment of these objectives, we see a very, very significant treatment gap. 9 out of 10 Ugandans with a severe mental illness don't receive the treatment they need. Furthermore, adolescent suicide rate is at 5.3 per 100,000, which is higher than the global average of 4.1 per 100,000. We also see the general suicide rate has decreased, so I will give credit where credit is due. Uganda has decreased its overall suicide rate, but this isn't necessarily significant as it's only from 10.5 to 9.9 in the span of between the years 2005 and 2016. So that's enough about the low-income nation.